Around the year 2000, I came across a WWF Royal Rumble arcade machine from Sega that I've only read about in gaming magazines, and I played a few games on it. Now, while I remember playing the WrestleMania arcade game from Midway years prior, this Royal Rumble game was more of a wrestling-based title than Midway's effort, which was more of a Mortal Kombat meets WWF sort of thing. As for the game itself, you could either compete in a series of singles matches or participate in the eponymous Royal Rumble match itself, which was one of the more frantic Rumble experiences that I've ever played before or since that game. So ought to make for a fun game to bring it home, right? Now eventually Sega and THQ did bring it home to the Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately, chances are not many people got to play this one because it was released somewhat late into the Dreamcast's lifespan before PlayStation 2 came along and demolished Sega's hardware dreams forever. Which is a bit of a shame because the Dreamcast offering of WWF Royal Rumble is a solid arcade conversion, even if it's lacking in the actual wrestling content. Now before we touch on the gameplay, let's look at the graphics and the sound because, just to get that out of the way. Essentially, Royal Rumble looks really good for a time and essentially looks much cleaner than anything you'll find on the original Sony PlayStation. However, that's not really saying much. The wrestler models look blocky but smooth, their faces are static and lifeless, and the cheesy cardboard audience looks particularly fake. On the other hand, I seem to recall the arcade game looking just about the same thing, so in that regard, the home port's pretty accurate in that regard. As far as the overall presentation goes, looks fairly nice. Various counters and menus are aesthetically pleasing for the most part. All in all, looks fairly nice, all things considered, but I felt it could have been somewhat a tad better, if nothing else. Also, another thing that I find is lacking are the arenas. You don't like that Royal Rumble pay-per-view set? Well, too bad, because that's the only set you're going to get. Mind you, that's all the arcade version had to work with, so I'm not going to argue on that point, but considering that this is a home port, I felt they could have added a couple more variations or a couple more arenas to the mix. Even if they're not related to the pay-per-view, add a Monday Night Raw or SmackDown or whatever the case may be. The backstage areas look nice, though, if you enable them, so there's that. In regards to sound, there's not much to say about sound in Royal Rumble. You have the various wrestler theme songs, but you only hear them when you win a match. The rest of the time it's just generic stock music that's neither memorable nor even remotely good. It's sort of just there, it sort of fills the void, so to speak. Alas, there's also no commentary in this game, which is somewhat disappointing at first, but otherwise not a huge loss since they haven't gotten down the art of commentary in a wrestling game just yet. And of course there's the usual stock array of sound effects for punches, kicks, takes down, generic wrestler grunts. Nothing particularly special, but nothing terrible either. It's just there. So presentation-wise, the game's alright, but what about the gameplay? Well, the one thing I should get out of the way before we dwell into it is that the roster featured in Royal Rumble is pretty small. You have about 20 plus wrestlers to choose from, and that's pretty much it. Not much else in terms of unlockables. What you see is what you get. Nothing more, nothing less. Again, that's about the same amount as the arcade game, but again, you figure they fit a couple more guys in there. If not immediately playable, then as surprise opponents, whereas you can unlock them and use them if you beat them. Home version exclusives, if you will. Sort of like what Capcom did with Street Fighter Alpha 3 on the PlayStation 1 and subsequent ports. There's probably a couple better examples out there, but I digress. So like I said before, there are two main modes in Royal Rumble. Exhibition and Royal Rumble, obviously. Exhibition is your standard arcade mode where you pick a WWF superstar along with a ringside partner who will aid you in double team attacks, and you must fight through all the other WWF superstars before facing off against the McMahons, Vince, and Shane in the final match. Brilliant. Now, depending on the options that you have set up, you could also have to contend with run-ins who will try to make your path to the final bout a bit harder, although to be fair, they're not that picky. They'll also attack the computer. Also, at times, you'll be warped to a backstage area such as a closet or some other place. Other than that, there's not much else to it. No championships to compete for, no feuds or anything of that nature. Even the combinations that you have to compete against are somewhat random at times, and it's also kind of awkward in some cases. It's not the most in-depth championship road ever conceived, but it's an arcade port, so I can't really fault the game on that count. But the true crown jewel of the game is the eponymous Royal Rumble match itself, in which you have to clear the ring of a number of wrestlers that keep coming in until you're the last man standing. Anyone who has seen a WWF, WWE Royal Rumble match, or Battle Royal in general, knows how the match works, and it works more or less on the same principle here for the most part. The only difference is that the game only takes into account how many superstars you alone have eliminated. It doesn't matter what the computer eliminates. It's only, you alone could have to eliminate 30 superstars, or whatever number determined by the options. So in essence, you could choose to eliminate up to 30 superstars to win a match, or 90 superstars if you're willing to go that far. Or hey, if you're that daring, you can go infinite and see how long you can last against an endless legion of WWF superstars. It's a pretty fun experience when you think about it, and unlike more recent WWE video game entries that invoke some convoluted, stupid mini-game to eliminate a superstar, eliminating a superstar from the match in this game is mind-numbingly simple that even Katie Vick could figure it out. Oh, right. Don't want to think about that. That's too early for this game, even. What makes this incarnation of the Royal Rumble impressive, at least in my eyes, is that it is possible to feature up to 9 wrestlers at one time. 9 wrestlers at one time is not a bad stretch for a console that's over a decade old, especially when you consider that the most recent wrestling games on the modern gaming consoles only feature 6 wrestlers at any one time. Of course, considering that there are times when you'll be facing off against multiple opponents at the same time, things can get pretty hectic. And it's only too bad that you can't play 9 players at the same time, because that would have been a neat concept, considering they had the whole online thing going at the time. Oh, there's support for 4 players, no doubt, but then again, it's the same case for some of the other wrestling games that weren't on the Dreamcast at the time. Still, the Royal Rumble mode is a fun experience in itself that most players have to try at least once. I've yet to see a wrestling game since then pull off the same hectic experience that this game's Royal Rumble does, and no amount of absurd elimination mini-games is going to equate the ring to a ring of 9 superstars at once. Regardless of which mode you play, the controls are fairly solid, with a simplistic format that allows you to pull off extravagant moves with relative ease. Aside from your usual assortment of grapples, punches, and whatnots, you also have double team moves you can pull off at certain times. As you fight on, you'll earn S points, which allow you to pull off more powerful moves and eventually your wrestler's finishing maneuvers, such as the Stone Cold Stunner, for example. As usual with these wrestling games, you could either score a pinfall or make the guy submit, although if you have the option on, you can just go for a quick knockout and be done with it. In some respects, it's a really bare-bones system that is even less sophisticated than you would find on the old WWF SmackDown games on the PS1. And while this is fine for an arcade game, for a home console release, it's quite lacking to say the least. On the other hand, though, it's much easier to pull off moves here than it is in Acclaim's wrestling offerings on the same system, so there's a saving grace. And as much as I like Attitude and Warzone and those games, I'd feel much better not having to execute some awkwardly convoluted button combination just to pull off a simple move like an armbar, much less a more complex move like the Saskatchewan Deluxe spinning nerve hold or some ridiculous move like that. Also, another nice thing about Royal Rumble is the minimal load time, so minimal in fact that you barely even notice them. This holds true even during the Royal Rumble mode where you have a whole bunch of guys coming in, even if it's the same 3 guys, but still there's very little load time that I've noticed, which is impressive to say the least. Much like any other arcade fighter, Royal Rumble allows you to adjust the difficulty setting so it could be as easy or as hard as you want it to be. But even so, I didn't find this to be an overly frustrating title, especially once you get the hang of the controls. The only real challenge stems from the Royal Rumble mode itself, which is essentially this game's version of a survival mode on steroids. That's probably not the right analogy considering the subject matter, isn't it? Guess not. At its best, WWF Royal Rumble is a game that does an excellent job of bringing the arcade game to the Dreamcast with little effort and is actually an enjoyable little game thanks to its really good Royal Rumble mode. With that having been said, however, WWF Royal Rumble is also a weak wrestling title in general, especially with regards to the other wrestling games of the time, which not only boast larger, more varied rosters, but also a plethora of match types and game modes that expand the game experience immensely. Still, this is a fairly good game that manages to entertain for the most part, and the fact that this ring can hold 9 guys at a time does give it some points for effort and uniqueness if nothing else. Dreamcast owners looking for pure technical wrestling brilliance on their console will probably have to look elsewhere on other consoles, because in that regard, WWF Royal Rumble is far from perfect, and quite frankly, the alternatives available on the Dreamcast, at least those that I'm aware of, aren't any better. But if you have fond memories of the arcade game or just want a quick arcade-style wrestling game without all the extra dressing and realism, then WWF Royal Rumble should satisfy your needs quite nicely.